Welcome to the first Ecoflix podcast with our special guest, Ian Redmond. And I'm proud to say, Ian, you are my friend, and I also know you are a proud father and grandfather. So welcome to Ecoflix.
Thank you, David.
And I know, and I hope everybody knows, and if they don't, they will now, that you are head of conservation for Ecoflix, which makes it entirely appropriate that we are here talking to you about your background, training, and specialty. And as I understand it, aside from knowing you're an acclaimed biologist and obviously you've been many places and done many things, but you say your training and experiences in field biology and of course conservation. What do you want people to know field biology refers to?
Well, I guess when you study biology, for a lot of the course that you might be studying, it involves sitting in a lab or reading textbooks. And there's been a huge growth in studies of cellular biology. And of course, that is fascinating because we're all made of cells. We want to know how our bodies and other species' bodies work. But to me, things get really interesting when the cells are organized into systems and the systems are organized into organisms, and those organisms themselves interact in ecosystems. And that's how the planet functions, at least the living part of the planet, the biosphere. And that's where we live. And that's what fascinates me.
So field biology is referring to much more than any one species or microorganisms separated from others. You're talking about the entire array of living and non-living things.
Which is why I like the word biology. I get called different ologies. Sometimes I'm called a parasitologist. Sometimes I'm called a primatologist. Sometimes I'm called an elephantologist, which is a bit of a... Anyway, those are all specialisms, obviously. But bio is life. And it's life that interests me. And studying life in all its forms is what fascinates me. So, but the field biology kind of implies mud and discomfort and being in the metaphorical field. Sometimes it's actually in the farmer's field because they're full of life too. But no, I'm happiest when I'm in an ecosystem that hasn't been dominated by human activities and that is in most ways how it evolved. So I guess it's evolution that fascinates me, and how different species behavior and physiology and anatomy allow them to not just survive, but to thrive, to prosper in their particular habitat. And we've spent so much of our time in the past couple of centuries converting those habitats to our own human uses, that sometimes what you see when you think you're out in nature is actually just a fraction of what was there before. But there are some parts of the world, and your backdrop is one such part, mine is another such part, where those ecosystems are still pretty fully functional, although there might be some components missing because some species have been hunted out, or there might be a road going through, so it's divided up. But yeah, nature as it evolved, and then working out how human activities have damaged that. And it used to be just a fascination with nature that led me to study things in the wild. But wherever I went to study, I was met with the problems of conservation, or the problems of poaching or destruction of habitat or degradation of habitat. So the species and sometimes the individual animals that I was studying or had got to know and had learned to trust me, and I trusted them. And it was a really interesting opportunity for interspecies friendships to develop. And then bang, some other human with a very different agenda, which, looking at it objectively, is probably just as logical to them as my agenda is to me, comes in and kills the animal. And then you're faced with the threat not only to the animals, but perhaps even to the species or subspecies. And in the two big occasions when that happened to me, it pushed me into conservation. So if people want my sort of life in a nutshell, a naturalist by birth, because I think naturalists are born that way. You can train people. Most children have it in them, but then it's knocked out of them or schooled out of them. So a naturalist by birth, a biologist by training, and a conservationist by necessity.
Yes, that's my favorite quote, Ian quote. I think that's a great one, and it sums you up nicely. You have so many honors and distinctions, it would be almost pointless to spend the entire time listing them, but
tedious too. Let's just bypass that.
But there are a few really nice and interesting things, and one of them involves your relationship with apes and your role as the person who established the existing Ape Alliance and chairs those organizations. Can you tell people a little bit about what Ape Alliance is and what they do and what you do?
Sure. Well, I guess I've been in the NGO world, the non-governmental organization world, since the first of my study animals was killed, and Diane Fossey put out the word. This was the story of Digit, a young silverback mountain gorilla who sadly died at the hands of poachers on the last day of 1977.
We'll get to that.
I'd known him for a little over a year, about 14 months. And he would choose sometimes to come and sit by me and I sort of just hang out, and we got on well, and occasionally he'd be playful, but generally he just seemed to be at peace in my company. I was certainly at peace in his. And I would describe that relationship as an interspecies friendship, because he could have sat anywhere in the forest and he chose to sit near me. And we sort of had what seemed to be a mutual understanding. Obviously, I don't know what was in his head, but from what I could,
to some degree you did.
To some degree I did, because I had to learn to communicate with the gorillas and to understand their body language and their vocalizations. And certainly he seemed at ease. When you're watching a wild animal, they're sort of phases. At first, they're afraid of you, because the general policy of any wild animal is be scared of humans. And then if you can overcome that fear, then they tolerate you. And then their curiosity gets the better of them. And of course, gorillas are primates like we are, and curiosity is part of their makeup as much as it is a part of ours. So then they want to study you, and you find yourself being studied by the very animals who you're studying. It becomes mutual. They don't take notes, but Digit did sometimes take my notebook and look at it curiously and then put it back. And this was a nice scene. He did that once on camera with Diane Fossey, where he took her notebook and had a look at it and then put it back in a lap. That's human stuff. You have that, but it's interesting. So having a wild animal who, in the course of my studying him and his family, he wasn't the lead silverback, he was a young silverback, just maturing on the periphery of the group. And he was about to face that big decision that every teenage lad faces at adolescence. Do you stay around at home, or do you go off and make your way in the world on your own?
And just for everybody's understanding, how big is Digit? You're sitting next to him. He's a young silverback, which means?
Roughly the same height as me, probably 2 or 3 times the weight of me. Arms span much longer than mine, legs much shorter than mine, belly much bigger than mine, even now. So an impressive individual, and with muscles. He'd lost the hair in his chest. When gorillas reach maturity, the male gorillas, is a sort of reverse to humans. Human boys don't have a hairy chest. They hit puberty, they start sprouting hair on the chest. Gorilla males have a fuzzy chest when they're little, and when they hit puberty, it's bare skin, and you can see the pectoral muscle. And that means that when they beat their chest, which is a very gorilla way of displaying your size and strength, they don't do it as in the Tarzan movies with a clenched fist. They do it with an open cupped hand. And I'd have to take my shirt off to do it properly. And even then, my pectoral muscles aren't really up to it. But if you hit that hollow beneath your pectoral muscle, it produces that pock sound, which is characteristic of an adult male chest beat. Pock, pock, pock. So he had the muscles, the bulk, but no responsibilities. So, he was still larking around with the black backs and no particular role in the group. And at that age, which is roughly between 10 and 12, some young silverbacks go off on their own or with a friend and search the surrounding area, get to know where the other groups are if they haven't already learned that whilst in their early years, and at some point try and attract some females and start a family. Or if the leader of the silverback, the alpha male, is old, they might hang around, and when he dies, they try and step into the leadership role of the whole group. So that's an interesting aspect of guerrilla behavior, and that's a sort of long-term data of the way guerrilla society works that the Karisoki Research Center has now been collecting for more than 50 years. It's extraordinary. It's 45 years since I went there. I went there in 1976, but Diane Fossey started in 1967. So she'd been there nearly 10 years when I got there. And the guerrillas were used to people. And it wasn't
This
Diane.
is in Rwanda, right?
Sorry?
This was in Rwanda?
Yes. Sorry. Pull back a little bit. Mountain gorillas live in the forest that is behind me in my backdrop. And they share that habitat with some forest elephants. Not many, because most have been killed for their tusks by ivory poachers. But the forest is like an island of forests surrounded by a sea of humanity, densely populated land, rich, fertile volcanic soils. And the Virunga volcanoes rise and form a chain of mountains on the border of Rwanda, where it meets southwest Uganda, so northern Rwanda, southwest Uganda, and to the west is what was then Zaire and is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. So those three countries share this habitat, but as far as the gorillas are concerned, it's home. And obviously they move across the borders. So do the researchers.
Let me interrupt you if I can. They've learned not to cross borders since Rwanda has a different policy than other places, have they not?
There have been times when there has been fighting on one side of the border, and gorillas, as do humans, basically are refugees. They come over the border to flee the fighting.
But Rwanda protects them, and not all places other than Rwanda do.
Well, the three parks that make up the Virunga volcanoes, I would say, are three of the best protected parks in the world. But there are on the Congo side armed militias, and when they choose to fight, they bring guerrilla warfare into the gorilla habitat. And that involves hiding in the forest and striking at nearby villages or military installations. And the gorillas certainly are terrified of that human behavior. I have sat with the gorillas on the Congo side, listening to explosions in the middle distance. And each time there was a, the gorillas would wince and look fearfully in that direction. And clearly, if any gunfire or explosions of artillery fire came closer, they would flee. And of course, that creates havoc in guerrilla society because they've got themselves nicely spaced out with overlapping areas of home range. And if human activities drive them into the neighbors, that can lead to silverbacks fighting. It can lead to infants being killed. It's a very disruptive process.
And it's quiet where they live. They are used to the solitude and they enjoy that.
It is true. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because although I mean, lone silverbacks might enjoy the solitude, but I think what they'd really like is to find some females and have some kids. And
sure.
But
gunfire does not signify females and kids.
They certainly enjoy the peace of the forest.
Yeah.
And whilst there are some very dramatic memories from those days with the gorillas, particularly visiting unhabituated groups that still thought that all humans are dangerous and therefore you should shout at them very loudly and hope they run away. There were also occasions when I was sitting and the gorillas I was studying were fast asleep all around me in the sunshine. And then someone might just stir and climb up onto a stump or a mound of vegetation and sit and just look at the view. And it seems as though they're just enjoying the beauty and the peace, the bird song, sunshine, drowsiness. Those are some of my happiest memories of sitting surrounded by sleeping gorillas. And that's the level of trust that they have in us human observers.
Yeah. And what percentage of the same genetic makeup are gorillas to humans?
Depends which study you quote, but about 98.4 is one of the most, I'm sorry, 97.7, about 98. Yeah,
Pretty
it's
extraordinary
very
when you
close.
think about it. I mean, that's pretty similar.
Yes.
It's hard to imagine a world where people wouldn't behave like animals, and animals could just be like we think of people peacefully living amongst each other, but the history of people is we're the animals and they're more civilized.
Well, they occasionally fall out and occasionally come to blows, but it's usually brief, and the reason for the fight is well, usually somebody wins, or they agree to a standoff, but they also sometimes have what you might call negotiated settlements.
But they don't fight to the death very often, and this is the point. We are cruel for cruel's sake. Some people absolutely enjoy killing, and that's seldom seen in the world of animals except for predator to prey.
It's true, and that's one of the curious things about human nature. And I'm as fascinated by human nature as I am about any other species, but that we're just one species, and I recognize and respect the other species. So, respect is a big part of my appreciation of nature.
It's huge. And let me take you back to where we started, the Ape Alliance.
Okay, so during the 1990s, when I'd already been involved in gorilla conservation and working in the NGO world, there was the Jane Goodall Institute, there was the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, there was the Orangutan Foundation, there was the International Primate Protection League, there was Born Free Foundation, and sort of multi-species groups like WWF and Fauna and Flora International that care about apes, and they hardly seem to talk to each other. And there were a number of attempts, initially led by the International Primate Protection League UK branch, to try and get them around a table saying, come on, let's collaborate in some way and make our voices stronger. And it wasn't happening. So towards the end of the last millennium, late 90s, it was just increasingly clear that around the world, ape populations were declining. As more field studies were done, more information flowed back to suggest that that particular population was in trouble. And I convened a meeting, which was actually hosted by the Royal Geographical Society, in their boardroom, big old Victorian table with portraits of bewhiskered Victorian explorers around us. And we decided to call ourselves the Ape Alliance and to form this loose sort of coalition. And not every member of the coalition agrees on everything with everybody, but it provides a shared platform for lobbying on behalf of apes. And I think one of our biggest successes was a few years later when I was in Nairobi at a CITES conference, conference of the parties of the UN's Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species.
And let me stop you there for a second, because in the UK, that is a well-known thing. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and it's plastered across the news whenever there is such a meeting. And we're up to 27, and there's been a lot of talk about it. But in America, can you explain to people what the heck is going on? Why is it that some places in the world not only know about but care about the Conference of the Parties, and in America we're literally in the dark? It's not discussed, and we need some light shed on the subject. So if you can explain it a little bit, that would be valuable.
Okay, well, my work with the NGOs led me to meetings of the United Nations that concerned wildlife. Initially, primarily trade in wildlife, which is what CITES does. And the COPs can be confusing because,
for the people who don't know, critically endangered
CITES, I mentioned, is a Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species.
Right.
But that's only one of several UN conventions. And every convention is governed by the Conference of the Parties. in the sense that that's the highest decision-making body. So, the world gets together and says, oh, we've got a problem with biodiversity. We need a convention where countries sign up to the convention and then agree to pass laws to standardize how we deal with nature.
Right.
And the Convention on Biodiversity, known as the CBD, has its COP series. The Climate Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has its conferences of the parties, but when it was set up, it was considered to be such an important topic that they didn't have their conferences every three years or so. They had them every year, which is why in the climate talks we're up to COP27 this year. Last year in Glasgow was COP26, and just before Glasgow was supposed to be COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention. And that's kind of confusing. Wait a minute, if COP15 is happening and then COP27 a couple of weeks later, that doesn't make any sense unless you remember that each convention has its own series of conferences of the parties, and they're all known within that conference as COP, whatever it is. And you can go slightly bananas trying to remember whether the next COP for this, I've served as an ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species. And that's last conference was only COP13. So it depends which which convention you're talking about, and where you are in their series of meetings. But the meetings are important because they essentially determine international law. And they're sometimes very laborious with long discussions about where to put the comma, where to put the full stop, and whether to add a word here to make it clearer. And then it has to be translated usually into several languages, and the translation isn't always as clear as it was in the original language. You're a lawyer, you know about these things.
Well, it's particularly important, CITES work, because it controls the transport of animals between countries. And so approvals from two different countries for this animal can be really a critical issue. And CITES is supposed to play a sort of neutral role, but even that can be political.
Humans are political animals. It's awfully hard to do human stuff and not get human behavior coming into it. And you're right, CITES controls animals moving across international borders under human control, in cages or dead and chopped up in bits. Whereas the Convention on Migratory Species is to help countries regulate animals that move of their own volition.
Yeah, no,
whether it's birds flying from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere and back, which they do, thousands of miles every year, or it's whales and turtles and dolphins that swim between territorial waters. If a species is protected in one country and it swims next door or walks next door, and suddenly it's just being hunted, then the countries that protect the animal are not going to succeed, because at some point in its migratory pathway, it's being killed. And that's why it's so important that the UN helps countries to rationalize their conservation of species that are threatened usually by human activities, hunting or loss of habitat or.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. So as part of your history, you were given an Order of the British Empire by the Queen, which is quite an acknowledgement. For the world that doesn't live in England and know what OBE means, can you explain it a little bit?
Well, it sort of dates back to the time of chivalrous knights, and someone who has done something good for the country or for their community might be awarded with a knighthood. I'm a couple of steps below a knighthood, but technically an OBE is an officer of the Order of the British Empire. And there are others who get an NBE, a member of the order, and others who do more than I've done, who get a commander, a CBE. So I'm in the middle. And it was a great surprise.
Anytime the Queen pulls your name out of a hat, you've done something pretty good. So that's special. And of course, as part of your work, you've become friends with some very notable people. Sir David Attenborough and Jane Goodall are among your friends. I'm curious about some of those stories, but let me move to that because I want to get to that in the context of the world, really. I want to do some darkness and then maybe move into the light a little bit. What's your take on where we are in the world in terms of our own imperfections and greed, frankly, leading to our current state? People talk about the next mass extinction. If we are on bound for that, we're number 6. What's your take on that? Where are we on that scale? Is it really as bad as people say, or are they being alarmist?
Well, I think that they are being alarmed, and I'm not sure that that makes them alarmist, but people who look at the data are alarmed. And what is alarming them is that we seem to have these multiple threats, which are becoming so global that they are being described as existential threats, that we as a species might face our own extinction if we don't somehow curtail what we do to the other species on the planet and in extraction of resources and polluting. So what are the major threats? We hear a lot about climate change, and it's self-evident with the UK just having topped a temperature of 40 degrees.
But people say that's no big deal. It happens. Look, it's cold in the winter. How can it be global warming? See how cold it is in the winter? Can you debunk
well, that's
that?
why essentially global warming is causing climate change. So the two are not the same thing. They're often used synonymously, but they're not. And the warming is to do with the proportions of gases in the atmosphere. And if more heat is being trapped, then the temperature will warm, and that will cause the climate to change. And some places will get colder, and some places will get hotter. But globally, the average temperature is rising. And if you think about a good example of why that matters, what does 1 degree matter? Well, think about the lines on the map that join temperature, the isotherms. The line that is along the edge of the permafrost, where it's permanently frozen, as the name suggests, in the tundra, in the Canadian North or Siberian tundra. A warming of 1 degree doesn't sound much, but that's hundreds of square miles of land, which previously was frozen all year round. The word permafrost explains that. And now it isn't. So whatever was frozen in the ground is starting to decompose. And that is actually releasing huge quantities of methane as the old vegetation, which has been frozen and solid and underground for thousands of years since the last ice age, is now releasing methane. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas in terms of its warming ability than carbon dioxide. So we're getting to the point where, okay, we've been burning fossil fuels for a couple hundred years, first coal and then oil and now gas, but these were the result of photosynthesis that happened millions of years ago. And that carbon has been sequestered and stored deep underground. And we're pumping it out at the same time as all the normal carbon cycle that happens in nature is happening. So we're just knocking things out of kilter. And what we're reaching is what are described as tipping points, where a relatively small change will suddenly lead to a chain reaction that will exacerbate the problem. So we're doing that with climate change. And the way that carbon cycle works in biology is that we animals breathe in CO2, breathe in air, which has oxygen in it, and we breathe out CO2. Plants normally take in CO2, store the carbon, and release the oxygen. And those plants might be forests, like behind you and behind me, or they might be the phytoplankton in the oceans. Wherever there's chlorophyll and photosynthesis going on, that's happening. And we are cutting down more and more forests and poisoning more and more of the phytoplankton. So there's less and less of that side of the equation. And at the same time, we're digging up fossil carbon and putting it into the atmosphere, increasing the burden. So we're in trouble. We need to stop destroying natural habitats and ecosystems, and we need to stop putting old fossil carbon into the atmosphere, which is exacerbating the problem.
But let's go back over what you just said in a nutshell. people in the planet are breathing in, and plants are essentially breathing out, a balanced equation that allows both of us to live. And it seems as if the populations of the world don't have any idea that there's a symbiotic relationship between the ecosystems of the world, not just what's behind you on a green screen, and 1 acre produces a certain amount of oxygen from the plants. That blends with other ecosystems worldwide. And eventually we have this planet that's protected by our ozone layer. How do we get people to know or understand that while it really wasn't a tenuous existence up until now, it's become tenuous because they don't understand what we're doing to the natural balance of all these ecosystems?
I think part of the problem is in our education system, in the what we might term the developed world, and in particular the urban world. If you live in a city, you're not cultivating crops unless you've got a window box and you grow a few herbs. But in rural communities that are living, particularly those living a subsistence way of life, where they just grow enough food for their family to eat, they're very connected to the earth. They handling earth every day, planting crops, and that direct connection with nature has been lost for those of us who live in cities, and our education system has not been up to the task of explaining that. So most people, I think, who live in cities regard natural things like trees largely of ornamental value. It's nice to have a park because it's green and pretty, and you plant nice flowers and you go for a walk and it's lovely. And it's as if that's its main function, to look nice. And it's almost unfortunate that so many species of animals and plants are beautiful to look at or fascinating to look at, that we're so attracted by them. We like them, but it's as if they're ornaments or they're to entertain us. So if we like an animal because that looks interesting, let's take it home and show it to our friends and keep it in a cage so that they can all come and see it conveniently without having to travel somewhere around the world to watch it. And that has led to this, I think, this concept, which is a misguided concept. I don't think it's necessarily done out of malevolence or evil. It's just we've gone down this rabbit hole where we live in a life that is largely devoid of interaction with nature. We try and keep spiders and flies out of our neat, tidy little houses, and any bit of biodiversity or variety of life that comes into the house, except for 1 or 2 companion animals and maybe some potted plants. We'll tolerate those. But any insects come in and eat our potted plants, you poison them, you get rid of them. So we live in a very nature depleted environment. And that is both a shame, because I think a connection with nature is an important part of the human makeup, but it's also very bad for nature because it's being squeezed out. And when there were just a few million or even a couple of billion of us, that was possibly tolerable. But now that we're approaching 8 billion, and every one of us wants a better standard of living with more stuff, more gizmos, a mobile phone or a vehicle to drive you around, there just isn't enough earth for us all to live like that. And that's going to be hard, because asking people to curtail their activities, it's a bit like asking people to take a voluntary pay cut. Why would I do that? No, I want to earn more money. Our whole economics is based on growth. If our company isn't growing, it's not succeeding. So there's been a very slow realization among some people that a steady state economy might actually be more sustainable. And yet every time you look at the news or the economic forecast, if the graph isn't going up, it's panic. And as often been said, if you believe in perpetual economic growth on a finite planet, you're either a madman or an economist.
Well,
But fortunately, there are some economists who are coming around to thinking actually they might have a point there. And we're having this interview 2 days after what's been called Earth Overshoot Day, which this year globally was on the 28th of July. And that means if you calculate the productivity of all the forests and phytoplankton and species on Earth that help sustain our biosphere, that productivity produces so much in terms of stuff, materials, wood, food. And we've reached the point where we've consumed that year's productivity by the 28th of July, which means that for the rest of the year, we're kind of going into overdraft.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable.
We're borrowing. And who are we borrowing from? We're borrowing from our kids.
Yeah.
We're going to have to somehow make up for this mess that we're getting ourselves in.
Yeah, and when you talk about oceans, phytoplankton, I think very few people understand what a massive role the phytoplankton play in not only the lives of creatures in the oceans that create the balance of that ecosystem, but in the planetary sense in terms of oxygen. And maybe talk for just a minute about the key role of phytoplankton that is invisible to most people. It's just, some tiny microscopic plant in the ocean. Why do I care?
But their role is such that it's estimated that every other breath we take, we should be thanking the phytoplankton. And what wasn't really understood was the role of marine mammals in fertilizing the phytoplankton. I talk a lot because I've studied gorillas and elephants, both of which are quite large mammals and produce large fecal piles, dung. I spent a lot of my life poking through gorilla dung, looking for parasites or seeds, and then elephant dung, which is even bigger. And because you can see the animals and you see the size of their dung, and if you've got them in captivity, that's a problem. If they're in the wild, it's part of the solution. It is what fertilizes the forests. But in the oceans, you don't see that. And although there are large animals like whales and dolphins and so on, they don't produce big dung balls. They produce what are known as fecal plumes. I love that phrase, fecal plumes, because it's particulate fecal matter that forms a cloud, and that cloud of essentially fertilizer is enriching the living layer at the top of the ocean.
But talking about
the
whales,
phytoplankton live.
Talking about whales, where's the enriching part for the phytoplankton? Where does that come from in the case of whales?
Particularly sperm whales dive deep and eat things at a lower depth. And iron is one of the nutrients that they bring up to the surface. So they catch food deep down, bring it in their stomachs, and when they defecate, it fertilizes the phytoplankton. So it's like a whale pump that circulates nutrients in the ocean.
Swimming down and swimming up, and down. The pump is them swimming up and down.
Yes, yeah. And there used to be many, many more whales in the oceans than today. And some people, because they see the big baleen whales that take a mouthful of water and then squeeze out the water and swallow the organisms that they're eating, krill and small fish and so on. When the whale numbers declined, people kind of expected that there'd be more and more krill because nothing's eating the krill. And what they found was the krill was declining. And the krill was declining because the krill wasn't getting enough phytoplankton to eat because the whales weren't fertilizing the phytoplankton. So we actually desperately need to increase whale numbers to something like their former level so that they fertilize the phytoplankton, which can then sequester and store the carbon and help to bring our out of balance climate into balance again.
Just another example of how interrelated all these disparate species are, and we're connected to all of them, whether we know it or not. And these chemical reactions and important relationships are developed over billions of years. And as they say, there are no mistakes. The things that don't work aren't around anymore, and the things that fit remain. And we're busy knocking out species and ecosystems like we're trying to destroy ourselves. Where are we in terms of, for example, animal survival as the state of our decline extends itself around the world?
Well, the recently published estimates of how many species face extinction in the not too distant future, within the lifetime of our kids, is about 1 million species. We don't know how many species there are because they haven't all been described, but it's a huge number. And each one of those species has a role to play.
These aren't
in the
animals,
ecosystem.
these are species of animals.
These are species, yes. The other thing which has become apparent, this year I'm 68, which means it's the 50th anniversary of me being an adult, turned 18 in 1972, hitchhiked across America, visited Yellowstone, the world's first national park, which was celebrating its 100th birthday. So I guess it's 150 this year. Happy birthday, Yellowstone. And that concept of setting aside areas of land that are spectacular for posterity has been a mainstay of conservation thinking for a long time. And now I think we're beginning to see the limitations of that. I mean, the parks and other protected areas have kept some ecosystems functioning, but very often now they are surrounded by human-dominated landscapes, agriculture, plantations, towns, cities, roads. And looking at most countries in the world, that they aspire to have maybe 15% of their surface area covered in protected areas, and try to keep an example of each ecosystem, a bit of forest, mountain, a bit of sea, and so as if they're trying to maintain an example. But that's not a functional approach, because these ecosystems are our life support system. So I ask people, look, if your elderly relative was in hospital on a life support system, and the doctor said, well, look, the best we can do is about 15% of what she needs, but maybe that'll do it. You would argue very strongly, no, we want as close to 100% of her bodily functions to be maintained by this machinery, so that hopefully she will recover from whatever illness and live a bit longer. Everyone hopes that their elderly relatives will have a few more years. So turning down a life support system to 15% sounds like a very bad idea when you're talking about a hospital. But when you're talking about ecosystems, people don't think of them as life support systems. They think of them as pretty places to go on holiday, or nice green things to make the cities look more attractive. So what we need is an education system that gets across this idea that animals are not ornaments, that trees and all the diverse life forms on the planet are what keeps us alive. And I'm a great believer in the concept of enlightened self-interest as a reason for conservation. Yeah. Once people get the hack, wait a minute, I want to breathe, I want to drink fresh water, I want to eat good food. And for that to happen, we don't just need 15% of our land in a protected area and all the rest covered in concrete and fields. We actually need functioning ecosystems. And the conservation world is changing. And the conservation of land between protected areas, which are often full of people, and in fact, some protected areas are full of people too. In the UK, all the national parks are full of farmers and mines and all sorts, but they operate within limits that protect whatever it was, natural features that caused it to be created as a national park. And we don't see enough of that in the developing world, where they're still following the Yellowstone model of kick out all the people and only allow the occasional tourist or a ranger into the park. We actually need more integration, and that's more people understanding about nature and more nature functioning ecologically, the processes that keep us all alive.
But aren't you proposing sort of a utopia that isn't within reach at the moment? You're talking about eliminating a lot of civilization in order to go back to nature.
Eliminating civilization? No, just making civilization better.
Well, but to do that, you have to eliminate
the Chinese came up
jungles.
The Chinese, in their latest 5-year plan that they're well into now, came up to the term of an ecological civilization.
Listen,
looking for ways that allow us to.
I'm totally at peace with that, but at the same time, you know, if you look at the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are wonderful stories there. I mean, you can Google it, how the wolves saved Yellowstone, and a remarkable lesson in how, you know, keystone species balance nature and put everything back the way it should be. But when you're talking about adding people to the equation and our excesses, there needs to be a really significant and conscious effort to do that. And that's, of course, not even underway. It's not a question of, have we gotten there yet? No one's even looking in that direction, except people like you and a few others who are enlightened enough to not only know that we need it, but this is what we need. A lot of people say, this damn global warming, you know, it's too hot here. How do I turn on the air conditioning? It doesn't, I don't like it this hot. But they don't realize it's a world connected problem, and that a lot of these things you're talking about require a huge change in view by humanity. Are you familiar with some of the things that John Liu is doing and referring to with Real Wealth? Have you seen his shows on that?
Bumped into a relative recently at an elderly uncle's home, who said he'd just been watching a film by John Liu on Ecoflix,
Right.
And was amazed at how 10 years of his advice had transformed an arid valley into a green valley.
Right.
Because he's rebuilding soil, and
Yeah,
people underestimate the soil. They think the soil is stuff that plants grow out of, rather than soil is stuff that plants produce. And you don't have the plants, you don't have the soil.
His point, though, John's point, who obviously is working with us, is very interesting. He says that we as people don't recognize that the real wealth in the world comes from natural ecosystem function. And we think cars and computers and airplanes represent wealth, but they all end up eventually on the junk heap, and they're not replenishable. Real wealth comes from natural ecosystem functions, which, if replenished, allowed to replenish, which they will do on their own, are the basis for creating cars and computers and real wealth. And so we misunderstand that real wealth is actually coming from ecosystem function. And I think that is so over the head of most people that it would be hard for them to even understand that. His point is, if you don't have air to breathe, you don't have food to eat, you don't have soil that can sustain crops, what good's your money? You're pretty much dead. And you can have all the computers and airplanes you want, it's not going to help you. So I think we're reaching a point where that is very important for people to understand. How do we get those messages out?
Well, how about a dedicated global educational channel that does just that?
That's a great idea.
Yes.
Let me shift gears on this for a second, though, because there's so many things we could talk about endlessly. Veganism versus being meat eaters. I mean, historically, through evolution of man, we have all consumed a lot of things that many people now say, oh no, should never do that. As a biologist, forgetting your own personal views, as a biologist, what do you say to people who are either a meat eater or vegan, if anything, if they were interested in your view?
I think it's not meat eating per se that is a problem. I think it's the industrial farming methods that take cattle out of fields and into sheds and feed them with cattle feed that's been shipped halfway around the world from a rainforest, for a former rainforest in Amazonia, which is now growing soy to feed them. Whereas today I was walking with my grandson down the lane where I live, introducing him to the goats and the sheep and the cattle that graze in the fields near our house. I'm personally, I'm an omnivore, so I'll eat whatever's put in front of me. But if I'm eating meat, I prefer it to be farmed naturally and killed humanely. And that's a strange phenomenon that farmers can nurture their cattle and have a very strong positive relationship with them, and then send them off to be slaughtered. Some people find that unacceptable. That isn't the unacceptable bit that gets me. It's the cattle and pigs especially that are kept in crates in huge factories and never see the sunlight or wallow in mud or feed in anything like a natural habitat. That they've just been turned into machines to produce protein.
Yeah.
And so if we want machines to produce protein, we're now developing methods to do that without all the inconvenience of having a central nervous system and a brain and the capacity to suffer, which is what so many farmed animals spend their life doing so that we can have meat on our plate. So, as I say, personally, for me, it's not the eating of meat that is the problem. Ecologically, it's the industrialization of farming. And people might come back and say, well, hang on, if people want to eat animal protein, they need a cheap supply because they can't afford all these fancy grass-fed, ultra-luxurious meat products, then I guess you eat less meat. And everyone can do that a little bit. And it used to be that you'd buy a joint of meat on a Sunday and it would make it last for the week. And come Friday, you have some fish. Now, fish is a problem too, because although fish farming is meeting a lot of the world's demand for fish, a huge amount is still wild fish. And the bigger the vessels that go out to hoover up the shoals of fish in the sea, the more damage they do to the ecosystem. If they're dredging along the bottom, they're churning up, basically destroying that fragile sea floor ecosystem. If they're tracking down shoals of fish with sonar and technical devices, they're just able to take everything. And I know people who live on the coast in Africa whose livelihood was paddling out beyond the reef and casting some nets and bringing back fish and selling it in the market. And there's no fish there because huge trawlers, factory ships have come from the other side of the world and are taking all their fish supplies. So what are the markets full of now? Bushmeat, because the only protein around is the mammals in the forest and birds in the forest and the reptiles in the forest and the rivers. So that overfishing in the oceans has caused an increase in hunting in forests. Who would have expected that? But it's as clear as day in this, where there's been surveys in West Africa that is happening. So there are certification schemes. Marine Conservation Society, MSC, stamp on your fish is supposed to show it's come from a responsible fishery. And it is possible if you can curtail the level of fishing to allow fisheries to recover in stocks. And we're seeing it happen where that is happening, but where there is poor law enforcement or industrial fishing ship fleets that don't really care about the law and the regulations, just trying to fill their freezers and get home and make as much money as possible, that is destroying the ocean ecosystems. And for all the reasons that we were saying earlier, how every one of us depend on the phytoplankton in the ocean, which is part of a food web, and the fish are only a part of it. And the sharks are kind of apex predators in that system. And we're killing sharks. And sometimes not even for the whole shark, just for the fins, because that's the bit that makes the money. So there are certain practices which are just awful in terms of animal welfare and in terms of common sense if you think it through. But the people who are doing those practices are being driven by the urge to make money, and we're all in a cash economy. So until the cash economy is turned into an economy that respects living nature, the only way in the cash economy you can make money from nature is by killing it, cutting down the tree, catching the fish, shooting the elephant, selling the tusks. And what we need is what our mutual friend Ralph Sharmy has described as a new economic paradigm, which values living nature.
And
And we
John
actually
Liu.
pay the nature for the ecosystem services that it provides us.
Right.
And that's something which I think is going to be happening very soon. And it's a kind of a race to see if we can change the global economy to value living nature in time before we destroy so much of it that the biosphere doesn't function.
So for each one of us, individually or with our families, what would you suggest we do? We can't change the fate of the Western world or our country even. What do we do as individuals? Is
Well, there's a lot to be
veganism?
said for leading by example. And I think everyone has the three P's: the power of their purse or pocket, your purchasing power. When you buy a product, if it's been produced irresponsibly, you're paying for that irresponsible behavior. And there are, if you
Promoting it.
certification schemes. So
And
you
you're
buy,
promoting it by buying it.
yes, but we now have the means to communicate very quickly. So on social media, if you see a product which say has palm oil that doesn't say this is from a sustainable source, doesn't involve deforestation, and that's a controversial issue. We haven't got time to go into the whole deforestation for palm oil, but palm oil is a wonder crop. It grows more oil per unit area than any other vegetable oil, but it grows best in places that used to be tropical rainforests.
Right.
So we have to stop cutting down tropical rainforests, which means no expansion of palm oil plantations. And the more responsible companies in the palm oil business have agreed to that. Okay, no more destroying forests, improving productivity by better strains, better breeding, better production methods. So if you're buying a product that doesn't say this is certified sustainable, we now can tweet or send a message using social media to the company that produces it saying, I was going to buy that product, but I see you haven't even got certified sustainable, so I'm not going to buy it. And how many tweets or messages on social media is a CEO of a company going to see before he starts thinking, this is bad for our reputation? So
If he sees them at
the
all.
very thing that in some ways threatens the world, our gizmos and devices, can, with the right push, be used to pressure corporations. So is that the power of our pocket? We've all got political power. Doesn't matter whether you're old enough to vote, you soon will be. And your elected representatives know that. So if you haven't written to your elected representative, whether you voted for them or agree with them, whatever, they are paid to represent your views. And if you haven't let them know your views on things like the protection of nature, then you're not using one of your P's. So that's your political power. And then there's your personal power, the example you set to your friends, to your family, to your kids, to your parents. We can all influence people. And again, these days on social media, whether you've got a few hundred followers or a few thousand, or in some cases, millions of followers, your views can be read by a lot of people. And we're in a position now where that kind of pressure can change people's behavior. It's absolutely essential that each of us reduce our personal ecological footprint. It's not just our carbon footprint, it's the impact we have on the planet. We want Earth Overshoot Day to be back at the end of the year. We want to spend each a same amount of the Earth's resources as it produces every year, and not be dependent on digging up fossil energy or borrowing from future production. And that way we'll have a sustainable future. Otherwise, we need more planets, and we haven't got any. It's an awful long way to find any more. So yeah, look after the one we've got.
So let's jump to something a little more fun. Tell us a little bit about some of the people in your life that people hear about but don't know. First of all, Diane Fossey, what was it like working with her? What should people know about her that isn't publicly known?
How long have you got? Diane was a former occupational therapist from a children's hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, who took out a loan and went on safari in Africa on holiday, and basically fell in love with the adventure. And in particular, she went to a place where most tourists didn't get then, not so many get there now, and that's to the Virunga volcanoes. And she managed to see, thanks to a filmmaker called Alan Root, who was there trying to film the gorillas, she managed to see some gorillas before gorilla tourism was even invented. And she was hooked. And she managed to persuade Louis Leakey, the paleoanthropologist based in Nairobi, to find sponsors for her to study the gorillas. And as they say, the rest is history. Her book, Gorillas in the Mist, was a bestseller. She was talking to a studio, Universal Studios, to make a film about it when she was murdered. And that film, Gorillas in the Mist, with Sigourney Weaver in the lead role. And Sigourney was very affected by that film. I had the pleasure of meeting her as part of her preparation.
My
for the
next
role.
question, tell us a little bit about her and your relationship with her.
Well, Sigourney explained to me that this wasn't just a role to her. She'd read about Diane when she was a student, the articles in National Geographic. She really wanted to do it well. And the fact that she's still the honorary chair of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International all these years later, what was that, 1988, that Gorillas in the Mist came out? So she's still involved. She's still
You were
supporting.
Diane's head researcher, right?
Sorry?
Your role with Diane, you were her head researcher?
I was her research assistant. I was her dog's body, her gopher. Go for this, go for that.
Go for that. But okay, so when she was gone, and they were making a film about this, how did you have a role with Sigourney Weaver in that?
I was doing a lecture tour in the States, and through Universal Studios, who had flown me over to New York to talk to the scriptwriter, they arranged for me to meet Sigourney, and I was in a motorhome. Okay, you want the details? I was doing a lecture tour of, what was it, 42 lectures in 35 cities in 3.5 months with my wife and 2.5-year-old twins, driving from city to city in a motorhome. And we parked on a friend of a friend's drive somewhere outside of New York, and Sigourney swept up in a massive limo, and we had dinner, and she recorded our evening.
In the mobile home?
No, we had the dinner in the owner of the property, who kindly provided dinner while we talked gorilla all evening. And Sigourney had brought this little real cassette tape recorder to record, and I was teaching how to communicate to the gorillas. How if you hear gorillas saying all's well, all's happy, all's fine, they sing when they're eating, and giving her some tips on how to play Diane. Diane had a short temper and a very rich vocabulary, and that doesn't really come across in the film because they wanted to make it a family film, so her cussing and swearing didn't come over. But she was a complex lady, and she was involved with gorillas for 19 years. You can't do that justice in an 1.5-hour movie. So they left out so much. Even they filmed some stuff. Diane had a friend called Ros Carr who had a flower plantation, and then after the genocide ran an orphanage. And Ros every Sunday had a troupe of local dancers on her lawn, and Rwandan dance is fantastic. Drumming and dancing, and Diane would be dancing with them, and she was full of life. She was a very vivacious woman, and that's very different from the portrait of her as a sort of an angry harridan in the mountain cursing the world. She I think loved life, but she didn't have a love of her life. She didn't find a partner to share all that, so she was sometimes lonely. And she lived through some very stressful times when gorillas that she knew and trusted had been killed. And those are the years that I was there. The death of Digit really changed Diane. And she began to focus more and more just on conservation and what she called active conservation, which is essentially law enforcement. But she was there and I was there as researchers, as foreign researchers, as guests of the government studying the gorillas. We had no legal authorization to go around arresting poachers and cutting snares, but no one else was doing it, so we did. And that's where the controversy comes in. So yeah, Diane was complicated. I would say she was a lousy boss, but a wonderful conservationist in those circumstances. But when some of her former students wanted to start running educational film shows in the surrounding communities, she scoffed at them because she said, look, every day in the forest, snares are being set. We need boots on the ground. We need active conservation, not the theory that if you show enough films to enough people, eventually people will stop poaching, because you only need 6 poachers to endanger the gorillas, and you've got tens of thousands of people within walking distance of the park. You don't want to reach all of them. So the conservation education, of course, it's important. And gradually, over the 40-something years since gorilla tourism started in 1979, really got underway in 1980. So in that time, there has become a culture of conservation around the mountain gorilla habitat. And that's why today, at the beginning of each year, there are more mountain gorillas than there were at the beginning of the previous year. So their numbers are picking up.
Yes.
And that is just wonderful. Diane would be so thrilled to know that.
And she would be, I'm sure. And of course, the social relationship between people and gorillas is what you're talking about. They built their economic society around gorilla protection instead of the reverse at the expense of gorillas. And it's quite an amazing success story in a very difficult area of the world. So that one we need to hold up and shine a big light on it, because people there recognize the value of the gorillas, and it's really worked.
It's true. And every year in Rwanda, they hold a big party called the Kwita Izina, where they name all the baby gorillas who've been born since the previous party.
Yeah.
And that's hosted by the president. And that recognition of the importance of individuals is, I think, inspiring.
Yeah.
But the dependence on ecotourism has proven to be fragile, because if there's a terrorist attack in Nairobi, people stop flying to Africa from some parts of the world, in particular North America. Africa's 53, 54 countries. But if one of them has a problem that gets on the news, people don't want to go. And when there's a pandemic, as we've just found,
you can understand
flights stop, tourism stops, and the flow of funding for the conservation and the community development stops. So really, although it worked for mountain gorillas in those circumstances, in those decades, we cannot save the world through ecotourism, partly because long-haul flights are part of the problem. We have to, limit the number of long-haul flights we take if we're going to reduce our personal carbon footprint. So what else is there?
Well,
payment for ecosystem services. We have to stop paying the gorillas for the work they do in the forest, in enhancing the forest's ability to sequester and store carbon, produce rainfall, and the elephants and the whales and all these other keystone species. We need to fund them through the economy at large, not through charities and aid money.
And some governments are more open to that than others. And I'm hopeful that your work in Gabon and other places, and in my case, Thailand, I'm hoping we can bring these principles to a real world recognition sooner than later. But let me shift now to, because we're, I think, running out of time here. Tell me, since we've been talking gorillas, is it true that you introduced David Attenborough to mountain gorillas?
I was the gopher at the time, and Diane said, go for the BBC. They're coming up to film a short sequence for the primate program of a 13-part series called Life on Earth. It was the first big natural history series that the BBC did, and David Attenborough presented it and conceived it. It's evolution writ large, and it was wonderful.
And what should we know about David Attenborough that we don't?
He's a very good raconteur. A good person to have as a dinner guest, because he's got stories that will just blow you away, and he seems to know everybody. As a former controller of BBC Two, before he went back into film production, he introduced colour television to the British public, and he realized that was good for two areas: sport. He was a person who brought billiards and snooker onto television, because in black and white, a game of snooker is really hard to follow. So there was no television of snooker or pool or anything like that. And natural history. And as a lifelong naturalist, he wanted to be the person that did the first big series. So he resigned from his position as controller of BBC Two, pitched a series before anybody else thought of it.
Is he trained as a biologist or a naturalist in any way, or does he just have a love for it and learned on the job?
He was a naturalist from boyhood, collecting fossils and being interested in natural history.
Yeah.
And yes, he did a degree, but he is very quick to say, I'm not an expert. People keep asking about gorillas. I just visited them once and filmed them for Life on Earth. But he has a very good way of telling stories. And his storytelling voice is the voice of natural history for many people in the world with television, because they've been hearing him, since they were children.
And tell us a little bit about Jane Goodall. What don't we know about Jane?
Jane is someone else with a great sense of fun. And although she's always being asked to speak very seriously about things, it's important to remember that she has a great sense of fun and a joy for life. And I think that's something which comes with a love of nature, a capacity for joy. And the really successful people who go into the media are those who can share that joy, because then it's a contagious delight in what they're seeing that people are responding to as much as what they're seeing. And I think that's such an important thing, which I know that Ecoflix is trying to capture, because if you want to get people's attention, it's no good throwing statistics and problem after problem. What they want is to be delighted and then realize that there's something they can do about the problems that are facing this species or that species. And that's why I'm so excited to be a part of the Ecoflix team.
Well, you are yourself a joy, and you certainly do evince a huge appreciation for life. And I think you're going to teach a lot of people about that, not just in this podcast, but in all the things you've been doing, because you've had a tremendous impact in so many ways. And I'm just so happy we had this chance to talk and record some of it. I'm very proud to work with you on Ecoflix materials, and let's go change the world.
Thank you, David. The feeling is mutual. And next time we'll talk about elephants. We didn't even get onto elephants. I've got elephants behind me in gorilla habitat. That herd of elephants I just watched interacting with a group of gorillas. But let's save that story for next time.
Yes, and you have obviously a specialty in tunnel elephants and other things. I mean, you're pretty well steeped in all things big animal, and much more. So yes, more for later, but a delight. So great to talk to you, and we will pick this up again. There we go. Subterranean elephants.
Little preview for next time.
Yes. Who are they? Where are they?
These are the only underground elephants in the world, and they live in the forests of Mount Elgon on the Kenya-Uganda border. But unlike any other elephants in the world, they go deep underground under the forest to get their dose of salts. But as I say, that's a long story, and I think we're done for now.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Thank you again. We'll talk again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.